Officer Desmond's furious voice echoed through the courthouse corridor, reverberating like thunder as he dragged Johnson Dixon toward a small hearing room. Interfering with a police investigation, he snarled, rattling off one trumped-up charge after another. His words dripped with indignation, each accusation more absurd than the last. A cluster of onlookers gathered nearby, their faces etched with a mix of disbelief and apprehension. Some whispered amongst themselves, exchanging nervous glances. Rumors had been swirling for months that Officer Desmond's aggressive tactics would eventually land him in trouble. To many, this seemed like the moment he had finally gone too far. Despite the painful grip on his wrists, Johnson Dixon maintained an air of quiet defiance. His hands were pinned uncomfortably behind his back, but his eyes locked onto the crowd with a steady, unyielding gaze. There was something unshakable about him, a silent promise that he would not be broken by yet another display of unwarranted power. The air in the corridor seemed to crackle like a live wire, heavy with tension. It was as though the walls themselves anticipated the explosive truth about to be laid bare. No one, not even Officer Desmond, realized just how monumental this confrontation would become. A few hours earlier, Johnson Dixon had been making his way toward the courthouse on a sweltering summer afternoon. The oppressive heat clung to him like a second skin, beads of sweat gathering on his brow as the relentless sun beat down. He had just finished running an errand at the local pharmacy when a frantic cry for help caught his attention. Near the parking lot behind a small grocery store, an elderly woman was patting her pockets in distress, her voice trembling as she called out, "Oh no! My wallet! It's gone!" Her hands shook uncontrollably as she bent to peer under cars, her movements growing more frantic with each passing second. Johnson didn't hesitate. Without a word, he walked over to her, scanning the ground for any sign of the missing wallet. The asphalt beneath his knees radiated heat as he crouched down, carefully moving aside bits of trash and debris. Finally, his eyes landed on a worn leather billfold partially concealed beneath a crumpled newspaper. "Is this what you're looking for, ma'am?" he asked, holding up the wallet. The woman's relief was instantaneous. Her face softened, and her hands reached out to clutch the wallet as though it were a lifeline. "You're a blessing," she murmured, her voice quivering with gratitude. Johnson smiled gently. "Anyone else would have done the same," he replied. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. His parents had raised him to act with kindness, no matter the circumstances, even in a world that wasn't always kind in return. With a small act of kindness behind him, Johnson continued toward the courthouse, a towering structure of white columns and stone steps. It loomed above him like a monument to justice, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in his chest. At 60 years old, Johnson had lived a life shaped by countless experiences, both good and bad. The older he got, the clearer it became that true justice was often an uphill battle, especially for people who looked like him. As he ascended the courthouse steps, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer, whose nameplate read Desmond, stood over a black teenager, his imposing frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the boy whole. The teenager, barely out of his teens, fidgeted nervously, his gaze fixed on the ground. Desmond's tone was harsh, laced with impatience, as he accused the boy of loitering. "This is a public building," the officer snapped. "What business do you have here?" Johnson could see the fear etched across the young man's face. His trembling hands betrayed his discomfort, and it was painfully clear that the boy wasn't doing anything wrong. Johnson had seen this scenario play out countless times before, and he knew it wasn't about loitering. It was something far more insidious. With a calm but firm voice, Johnson stepped forward. "Excuse me, officer," he said, his tone steady. "Is there a problem here?" Desmond turned, his sneer growing as his eyes landed on Johnson. "Step aside, old man," he spat. "This doesn't concern you." His grip on the teenager's sleeve tightened as he added, "You people are always defending the wrong crowd." Johnson felt a slow burn rise in his chest, a deep anger born from decades of witnessing injustice. But he kept his composure. "He's not causing any trouble," Johnson said evenly. "This is a public courthouse. He has every right to be here." Desmond's expression hardened. "Are you interfering with a police investigation?" he barked, his voice rising. "I'm simply asking you to treat him with respect," Johnson replied, his voice calm but unyielding. "That's not interference. That's accountability." The tension reached a boiling point as Desmond's temper flared. Within moments, he grabbed Johnson by the arm, dragging him toward the courthouse corridor while rattling off accusations. The teenager watched in stunned silence, too scared to speak up, as Johnson was hauled away like a criminal. But Johnson's resolve never wavered. As the crowd gathered, their whispers growing louder, he knew that the fight for justice wasn't just his own. It was for every young man like the teenager he had tried to protect, for every person who had ever been silenced or dismissed. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reckoning, and Johnson-Dixon was ready to stand his ground. Here's the revised and expanded version of your story, polished for clarity, grammar, and pacing to fit a 4-page structure. "Is he doing anything wrong?" Johnson asked, his voice steady as he met the officer's icy glare. Officer Desmond scoffed loudly, dismissing the question with a wave of his hand before turning back to the frightened teenager. But in that moment, the young man seized his chance. Without hesitation, he slipped away into a cluster of bystanders who had gathered to watch the commotion. Desmond, realizing he had lost his target, whirled around in a fury. His glare landed squarely on Johnson, and his expression darkened. Without warning, the officer seized Johnson's arm in a vice-like grip. "You want to interfere? Fine. You can come inside and explain yourself to the court," Desmond growled, his voice dripping with disdain. Several onlookers gasped at the sudden aggression. A few shouted protests, while others remained rooted in place, too shocked to act. Johnson's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he forced himself to remain calm. Looking Desmond in the eye, he said in a steady, low voice, "I have nothing to hide." Desmond didn't respond. Instead, he dragged Johnson toward the courthouse doors, his heavy steps echoing through the uneasy silence of the crowd. Johnson forced himself to breathe evenly, a quiet mantra running through his mind. Stay calm. Don't give him the satisfaction. But deep inside, his frustration simmered. Why does this keep happening? Year after year, generation after generation. The courthouse lobby was a grand, imposing space with high ceilings and polished marble floors. Desmond's boots clattered noisily as he stormed through, dragging Johnson along. Heads turned at the commotion. Curious onlookers, off-duty officers, and courthouse staff paused mid-conversation to watch the scene unfold. Some of them recognized Desmond immediately, their expressions betraying a mix of alarm and... The officer was notorious for creating unnecessary conflicts, and today was no exception. The tension in the lobby was palpable as quiet murmurs circulated among the onlookers. Yet, despite the unease, no one dared to step in or challenge the situation. Reminder: don't forget to subscribe to this channel and feel free to leave your comments and likes. Desmond led Johnson into a small hearing room. Though it wasn't packed, a noticeable crowd had gathered, their faces tense with expectation. The air was thick with an almost tangible unease. The officer wasted no time. He launched into a tirade of exaggerated accusations, rattling off charges with theatrical flair. Obstructing a police investigation, disturbing the peace, attempted assault of an officer. Each claim fell from his lips like a hammer blow, utterly devoid of truth. Johnson felt a cynical laugh bubble in his chest, but he suppressed it. Attempted assault? For speaking out against injustice? That's a new one, he thought bitterly. A bailiff standing nearby raised an eyebrow, his disbelief plain. The court clerk, a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes, shot Johnson a fleeting look of sympathy. It was clear she recognized the absurdity of the situation, but her role was to record the proceedings, not to pass judgment. Meanwhile, Desmond puffed himself up, clearly reveling in the attention. His words grew more venomous, laced with the kind of unchecked bigotry that left no doubt about his intentions. It was as though he delighted in asserting his power over anyone he perceived as lesser. And in Desmond's eyes, Johnson fit that category perfectly. But Johnson refused to be rattled. He maintained an air of calm dignity, answering the clerk's procedural questions with concise respect. When asked if he had legal counsel, he simply replied, "I can represent myself if necessary." A ripple of surprise coursed through the room. Some whispered, wondering if Johnson was a lawyer. But he said nothing more. Timing, he knew, was everything. The room fell silent as Judge Keller entered. An older man with thoughtful eyes and a measured demeanor, he settled into his seat at the bench, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the room. His gaze landed on Desmond, then shifted to Johnson. His frown deepened. It was clear that the judge sensed something wasn't right. But the formalities of the courtroom required him to proceed with caution. "Officer Desmond," Judge Keller began, his tone slow and deliberate, "I'd like to hear precisely how Mr. Dixon posed a threat. To you, or your investigation." Desmond straightened, clearly eager for his moment to shine. What followed was a distorted tale, so exaggerated it bordered on the absurd. In his twisted version of events, Johnson had rushed at him, interfering with an active investigation and putting everyone at risk. Never mind that the so-called investigations involved harassing a random teenager near the courthouse steps. As Desmond spoke, Johnson observed him carefully. The officer's tone grew more dramatic with every sentence, but the cracks in his story were glaringly obvious. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Even those unfamiliar with the full context of the situation could tell that Desmond's account didn't add up. When it was Johnson's turn to speak, he stood with quiet confidence. His voice was calm and measured as he recounted the events exactly as they had occurred, detailing how he had simply intervened to prevent an unjust escalation. "I acted as any concerned citizen would," Johnson said, meeting the judge's gaze directly. "There was no threat, no interference. Just an attempt to ensure fairness and respect." His words carried a weight that silenced the room. Even those who had doubted him couldn't ignore the sincerity in his tone. Judge Keller leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. After a long pause, he turned to Desmond. "Officer, I find it difficult to reconcile your version of events with the facts presented here today." Desmond opened his mouth to protest, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "This court does not tolerate abuse of power or baseless accusations. Mr. Dixon has demonstrated nothing but composure and respect, qualities we expect from law enforcement as well." The room erupted into whispers, and a few members of the crowd even clapped softly. Desmond's face turned crimson as the weight of the judge's words sank in. As the proceedings came to a close, Johnson felt a deep sense of relief. Justice, though often elusive, had prevailed, at least for today. Outside the courthouse, the same crowd that had witnessed his arrest now greeted him with nods of respect. Johnson walked away with his head held high, a quiet reminder to everyone watching that dignity and truth could stand strong in the face of prejudice. The courtroom was a study in tension, the air thick with anticipation. The more Officer Desmond spoke, the more his words dripped with condescension, his self-assured demeanor grating against the growing unease in the room. Johnson, standing tall on the opposing side, remained calm, though he could feel the collective discomfort of the spectators. Some in the crowd openly expressed their outrage. An older woman shook her head in dismay, her lips pursed as though holding back a comment. A younger man, dressed in a tailored suit, leaned forward slightly, his eyes burning with a quiet readiness to intervene. Yet no one spoke up. Perhaps they had grown too accustomed to seeing men like Desmond run roughshod over vulnerable people in this very courthouse. Then, just as the tension seemed ready to burst, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A courthouse official entered hastily, a slim folder clutched in his hands, his expression urgent. Judge Keller, seated at the bench with his characteristic composed authority, looked up, his irritation evident. "Is there something that can't wait?" the judge asked, his tone clipped. The official leaned forward and whispered something to him. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of surprise crossed Keller's otherwise unreadable face. Clearing his throat, he tapped his gavel lightly. "We will take a brief recess," he announced. "The court will reconvene in 15 minutes. The gallery erupted into hushed murmurs, speculation rippling through the room like an electric current. People exchanged guesses about what new development had just unfolded. Desmond's confident smirk faltered slightly as he glanced at the judge, clearly sensing something had shifted. Johnson, on the other hand, stood silently, his composure unshaken, though his mind churned with curiosity about what had just occurred. When the hearing resumed, the tension was thicker than ever, pressing down on everyone in the room. Officer Desmond stood by the prosecution's table, arms folded across his broad chest, his jaw set in defiance. He still seemed convinced he held the upper hand. Johnson, now seated at the opposing table, sat upright, his hands calmly clasped before him. Judge Keller's gaze shifted between the two men, his tone calm yet authoritative. "Officer Desmond," he began, his words deliberate, "you have made serious accusations against Mr. Dixon. I need you to confirm, under oath, that you stand by every claim you've made." Desmond lifted his chin, his eyes darting briefly around the room as if searching for validation. "Absolutely, Your Honor," he declared, his voice full of smug assurance. A faint grin tugged at the corner of his mouth, as though he believed victory was within reach. The judge nodded slowly, his expression neutral. "I see," he said. Then, "In light of new information provided to this court, I believe Mr. Dixon has a statement of his own." He turned his attention to Johnson. "Mr. Dixon, you may proceed." Johnson drew a slow, measured breath. The weight of the moment pressed against him, but he met it head-on. He rose from his seat, the room seemingly holding its collective breath. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but edged with quiet conviction, "there has been a monumental misunderstanding." The room grew still, every eye fixed on him. "I speak not only as a concerned citizen but also in my official capacity," Johnson continued. Slowly, he reached into his coat and retrieved a gold badge pinned discreetly to the inside. He held it up for the courtroom to see. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Whispers erupted among the spectators. "Oh my goodness," someone murmured. Another voice added, "I knew there was something about him." Johnson let the moment linger before speaking again, his tone unwavering. "I am the chief federal prosecutor for this district and several others," he stated. "My duties include overseeing civil rights cases, including those alleging abuses of power." Desmond's face drained of color so swiftly it was almost comical. The once smug officer now looked as though the ground beneath him had vanished. Judge Keller remained composed, though a faint arch of his brow betrayed his own reaction. It was clear he had suspected something all along. Turning to face Desmond directly, Johnson continued, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "You accused me of obstructing justice when, in reality, you were harassing an innocent teenager. I acted only to defend him from your baseless threats." Johnson's voice was calm, but the undercurrent of anger was unmistakable. It was the voice of a man who had witnessed far too many injustices and refused to stay silent any longer. "This kind of conduct cannot be tolerated, not by me, not by this court, and not by any citizen who believes in the rule of law." Desmond stumbled over his words, his once boastful demeanor now reduced to stammering. I had no idea," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. But there was no sympathy to be found in the room. The faces around him reflected only silent condemnation. Judge Keller cleared his throat, drawing the courtroom's attention back to him. "Officer, your actions appear not only unprofessional but potentially illegal. I am ordering an immediate review of your conduct," he announced, his tone firm. Then, turning to Johnson, the judge softened slightly. "Mr. Dixon, you have this court's apologies for any inconvenience. All charges against you are, of course, dismissed." A wave of relief and validation washed over Johnson. As he turned to face the gallery, many spectators broke into quiet applause, their respect for him palpable. Johnson offered a polite nod, his expression one of quiet triumph. For Desmond, there was no escape from the weight of his actions. The courtroom had turned against him, and the walls that once seemed to support his arrogance now seemed to close in. Justice, long overdue, had finally been served. Officer Desmond's furious voice echoed through the courthouse corridor as he dragged Johnson Dixon toward a small hearing room. Interfering with a police investigation, he snarled, rattling off one trumped-up charge after another. A cluster of onlookers stared in disbelief, some whispering that the officer had finally gone too far. Johnson's wrists, uncomfortably pinned, didn't stop him from locking eyes with the crowd. Despite his predicament, there was an unshakable resolve in his gaze, a silent promise that he would not be broken by yet another display of unwarranted power. The tension crackled like a live wire, as though the very walls sensed that an explosive truth was about to be revealed. No one, not even Officer Desmond, realized just how epic this showdown would become. Earlier that day, Johnson Dixon was making his way toward the courthouse on a sweltering summer afternoon. Sweat gathered on his brow under the relentless sunlight. He had just finished an errand at the local pharmacy when he heard an elderly woman calling out for help near the parking lot behind a small grocery store. Her voice trembled with panic as she patted her pockets and peered under cars in a desperate search for her missing wallet. Johnson took one look at her trembling hands and decided to step in. Kneeling down on the hot asphalt, he scanned the ground until he spotted a worn leather billfold partially hidden beneath a crumpled newspaper. Relief flooded the woman's face as she clutched the wallet to her chest like a lifeline. "You're a blessing," she murmured, her voice shaking with gratitude. Johnson simply smiled and assured her that anyone else would have done the same. Deep down, however, he knew that wasn't entirely true. His parents had taught him from childhood to act with kindness, even when the world wasn't so kind in return. With that small good deed behind him, Johnson continued toward the courthouse, a towering structure of white columns and stone steps. It stood like a monument to justice, yet he couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The older he got, the more it seemed that true justice was an uphill climb for people who looked like him. At 60 years old, with a lifetime of experiences that had shaped his resolve, Johnson knew this all too well. Halfway up the steps, he noticed a commotion near the entrance. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer, his nameplate read Desmond, was looming over a black teenager who could hardly meet his gaze. The officer angrily accused the teen of loitering, though this was a public building open to everyone. Desmond's tone was laced with impatience, and Johnson suspected something far more insidious. Johnson's voice was calm as he intervened. "Excuse me, officer, is there a problem?" The teen's hands shook slightly, and fear was etched across his face. Officer Desmond sneered, clearly offended by the interruption. "Step aside, old man," he spat, tightening his grip on the teen's sleeve. "You people are always defending the wrong crowd." Johnson felt a slow burn in his chest, anger born from decades of witnessing such blatant contempt. But he kept his composure. "He's not doing anything wrong," Johnson said, meeting the officer's icy stare. Desmond scoffed loudly and turned back to the teen. In that moment, the young man seized the chance to slip away into a cluster of bystanders. Furious at losing his target, Desmond pivoted and fixed his glare on Johnson instead. Without warning, the officer seized Johnson's arm in a vice-like grip. "You want to interfere? Fine. You can come inside and explain yourself to the court." Several onlookers gasped at the sudden aggression. Some shouted in protest, while others seemed too shocked to move. Johnson's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he looked at Desmond calmly. "I have nothing to hide," he said, his voice steady and low. Desmond dragged him through the heavy courthouse doors, leaving the murmuring crowd behind. Johnson forced himself to breathe evenly, reminding himself that anger would only feed the prejudice he faced. Deep inside, though, frustration simmered. Why did this continue, year after year, generation after generation? Inside the courthouse, the drama only escalated. Desmond wasted no time launching into exaggerated accusations, obstructing a police investigation, disturbing the peace, even an outlandish claim of attempted assault on an officer. Each charge fell from Desmond's lips like a hammer blow, lacking any factual basis. Johnson fought the urge to laugh bitterly. Attempted assault? For speaking up against injustice? Judge Keller, an older man with thoughtful eyes and a measured demeanor, listened intently. It was clear from his expression that something about Desmond's story didn't sit right. He turned to Johnson. "Do you have a statement, Mr. Dixon?" Johnson drew a slow, measured breath. The entire room seemed to hinge on his words. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady yet edged with quiet conviction, "there's been a misunderstanding of monumental proportions. I speak not only as a concerned citizen, but also in my official capacity." With that, Johnson reached into his coat and revealed a gold badge pinned discreetly inside. A low gasp rippled through the courtroom. He let the moment linger before continuing, his tone unwavering. "I am the chief federal prosecutor for this district and several others. My duties often involve overseeing civil rights cases, including those alleging abuses of power." The color drained from Desmond's face so swiftly it was almost comical. The judge arched a brow, as though confirming something he had already suspected. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the gravity of Johnson's words sank in. Turning to Desmond, Johnson's voice carried both the composure of a seasoned legal mind and the deep undercurrent of anger. "You accused me of obstructing justice when, in fact, you were harassing an innocent teenager. I sought only to defend him from your baseless threats. This conduct cannot be tolerated, not by me, not by this court, and not by any citizen who believes in the rule of law." Desmond stumbled over his words, but there was no sympathy to be found in the faces around him. Judge Keller cleared his throat and delivered a sharp rebuke. "Officer, your actions appear not only unprofessional but potentially illegal. I'm ordering an immediate review of your conduct. Mr. Dixon, you have the court's apologies for any inconvenience." As Johnson stepped out of the courthouse into the warm air, he was met with applause and admiration. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a moment that underscored a much larger truth about justice, race, and power. Today, the truth had come out swiftly and powerfully, proving that justice, though it may stumble, can still stand tall when the right people uphold it. Johnson had spent a lifetime gathering experiences that shaped his resolve, each one a brick in the fortress of his character. As he ascended the courthouse steps, the sweltering summer sun bore down on him, soaking his shirt with sweat. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had faced a lifetime of trials and refused to be bowed by any of them. But halfway up the imposing stone staircase, something caught his attention, a commotion brewing near the entrance. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer, his nameplate reading Desmond, loomed over a black teenager who stood frozen, eyes glued to the ground. The officer barked accusations, claiming the teen was loitering. Johnson's gaze swept over the scene, noting the nervous shuffle of the boy's feet and the fear etched across his face. This was a public building, open to everyone, but Desmond's tone carried something far more sinister than mere impatience. Johnson had seen this play out too many times before. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, officer. Is there a problem?" Desmond turned to him, sneering with open contempt. "Step aside, old man," he spat, tightening his grip on the teen's arm. "You people are always defending the wrong crowd." Johnson felt a slow, familiar burn in his chest. Decades of witnessing this kind of blatant disregard for dignity and justice had taught him to temper his anger, to keep his composure even when every fiber of his being screamed for action. Meeting the officer's icy stare, he replied evenly, "He's not doing anything wrong." Desmond scoffed loudly, as if dismissing Johnson's very presence. But in that moment of distraction, the young man seized his chance, slipping out of the officer's grip and disappearing into a cluster of bystanders. The officer's face darkened with fury as he watched his target vanish. He turned back to Johnson, his glare filled with venom. Without warning, Desmond grabbed Johnson's arm in a crushing grip. "You want to interfere? Fine. You can come inside and explain yourself to the court." Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd, and some voices rose in protest. Others, too shocked or intimidated, remained silent. Johnson's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he met the officer's aggression with calm defiance. "I have nothing to hide," he said, his voice steady. Desmond dragged him through the courthouse doors, the murmurs of the crowd fading behind them. Johnson forced himself to breathe evenly, willing his frustration to stay buried. Anger, he knew, would only feed the prejudice he was facing. Still, a question nagged at him, as old as the fight for equality itself. Why must this continue, year after year, generation after generation? The marble floors of the courthouse lobby amplified the heavy thud of Desmond's boots. Johnson followed, enduring the stares of curious onlookers and off-duty officers who seemed both puzzled and alarmed. A few whispered among themselves, mentioning Desmond's notorious reputation for overstepping his bounds. But no one stepped in, their silence a testament to how often this kind of scene had played out before. Johnson was ushered into a small hearing room. Though not packed, enough people had gathered to form a tense, expectant crowd. Desmond wasted no time, launching into a tirade of exaggerated charges. He accused Johnson of obstructing a police investigation, disturbing the peace, and even attempted assault on an officer. Each accusation dropped like a hammer, lacking any shred of evidence. As Desmond rattled off his charges, Johnson couldn't help but feel a cynical laugh bubble up inside him. Attempted assault? For speaking up against injustice? That's a new one, he thought bitterly. His face, however, betrayed none of his inner frustration. He stood with an air of calm dignity, his posture upright, his gaze steady. The court clerk, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s, glanced at Johnson sympathetically. Though her role required impartiality, the absurdity of the situation was clear in her expression. Still, her job was to record, not to judge. Desmond, on the other hand, reveled in the spotlight. He puffed himself up, his words dripping with venomous authority. His tone was so overtly bigoted, so brazenly self-assured, it almost took Johnson's breath away. The officer was clearly enjoying his display of power over someone he deemed inferior. When asked if he had legal counsel, Johnson replied calmly, "If necessary, I can represent myself." A ripple of surprise ran through the room. Johnson's quiet confidence unsettled even Desmond, though the officer was too wrapped up in his performance to admit it. Johnson stood tall, his resolve unshaken, a living testament to the strength it took to endure and resist. As the hearing unfolded, Desmond's accusations grew increasingly outlandish, drawing murmurs of disbelief from the crowd. Johnson remained composed, answering procedural questions with respect and clarity. His demeanor was that of a seasoned professional, a man who had weathered far worse storms than this. The tension in the room was palpable. Spectators exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from outrage to silent admiration for Johnson's unyielding poise. Somewhere in the back of the room, an elderly woman who had been following the proceedings closely nodded approvingly. Her gaze seemed to say, "Stay strong. The truth will prevail." And though Johnson couldn't yet see how, he knew she was right. Deep down, he understood that moments like these, where justice teetered on the edge of failure, were the moments that define progress. As he stood there, facing the storm of Desmond's accusations, he silently vowed to see this battle through to the end. For himself, for the young man he had stepped in to protect, and for everyone who had ever been told to step aside and stay silent. Justice, Johnson reminded himself, was not always swift or fair. But today, he resolved, it would not be denied. Johnson had always known that timing was everything. As he stood in that courtroom, the weight of the moment was palpable. He remained silent, his mind focused on the unfolding drama before him. The judge, an older man with thoughtful eyes and a measured demeanor, took his seat at the bench. Judge Keller surveyed the room before locking eyes with Officer Desmond. His frown deepened as he regarded the officer's testimony, sensing something off about his story. However, formalities required that he proceed with caution. "Officer Desmond," Judge Keller began, his voice slow and deliberate. "I'd like to hear precisely how Mr. Dixon posed a threat." Desmond, who had grown more confident with every word he spoke, proceeded to spin an exaggerated tale. In this twisted version of events, Johnson had allegedly rushed the officer, hindering an active investigation. Never mind that the so-called investigation involved harassing a random teenager on public steps. The more Desmond spoke, the more the tension in the room escalated. His words dripped with condescension, as though he truly believed his account would go unchallenged. Johnson stood still, his expression calm but resolute. He caught glimpses of the crowd, some of whom appeared outraged. An older woman shook her head in dismay, while a younger man in a tailored suit seemed ready to intervene. Yet no one spoke up. Perhaps they had grown accustomed to seeing men like Desmond trample over vulnerable people in this very building. Just as the tension reached its peak, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A courthouse official rushed in, holding a slim folder, his expression urgent. Judge Keller paused, irritation flickering across his face. "Is there something that can't wait?" the judge asked. The official whispered something into the judge's ear. A flicker of surprise crossed Keller's face, and he cleared his throat. "We will take a brief recess," he declared, tapping his gavel lightly. "The court will reconvene in 15 minutes. The room erupted into whispers as people speculated about the new information that had just arrived. Johnson could feel the energy shift in the room. This was the moment he had been waiting for. What happened next would change everything. When the hearing resumed, the air was thick with anticipation. Desmond stood at the prosecution's table, his arms folded in defiance, clearly convinced that he had the upper hand. Johnson, on the other hand, took his place on the opposing side, his hands clasped in front of him, his posture upright and resolute. Judge Keller glanced from the file in front of him to Desmond, then to Johnson. "Officer Desmond," Judge Keller's voice was calm yet resonant. "You've made serious accusations against Mr. Dixon. I need you to confirm under oath that you stand by every claim." Desmond lifted his chin, his eyes scanning the room. His voice dripped with arrogance as he responded, "Absolutely, Your Honor." A smug grin crept across his face, as if he were already sure the game was won. Johnson watched him with a mixture of disbelief and ironic amusement. It was hard to believe the officer was so sure of himself, despite the holes in his story. Judge Keller nodded, unfazed by Desmond's demeanor. "I see," he said. Then, in light of new information provided to this court, "I believe Mr. Dixon has a statement of his own." The judge turned his gaze to Johnson, his expression serious, but not unfriendly. "Mr. Dixon, you may proceed." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Johnson took a slow, measured breath of his own before stepping forward. His voice was steady, but carried a quiet conviction that commanded attention. "Your Honor," Johnson began, his words carefully chosen, "there's been a monumental misunderstanding here today. I speak not only as a concerned citizen, but also in my official capacity." With that, Johnson reached into his coat and slowly pulled out a gold badge that had been discreetly pinned inside. A low gasp rippled through the crowd. The once confident sneer on Officer Desmond's face faltered as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The room was stunned into silence. Desmond stood motionless, his face paling as he processed the revelation. The officer's earlier bravado seemed to evaporate in an instant. Johnson's gaze never wavered. He had been through far too much in his life to let this moment pass by unnoticed. Judge Keller's eyes widened slightly as he looked from Johnson to the badge and then back to Desmond. "Mr. Dixon," he said, his voice now softer but still commanding, "are you saying that you hold an official position in the legal system?" "Yes, Your Honor," Johnson replied, his voice unwavering. "I am the chief federal prosecutor." Desmond's expression shifted from disbelief to something resembling panic. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. The court clerk, who had been quietly observing, shot a glance of sympathy toward Johnson, but she remained silent, knowing her role was only to record the proceedings. The crowd, which had been silent until now, began to stir. Whispers of realization spread like wildfire. It was one thing for Desmond to bully a defenseless teenager. But now, confronted with a man of Johnson's stature, the officer's arrogance seemed out of place. It wasn't just the revelation of Johnson's true identity that made the moment so impactful. It was the sudden shift in power. Desmond was no longer the authority figure in the room. The truth had tipped the balance in Johnson's favor. Johnson stood tall, unflinching in the face of the officer's stunned silence. "This isn't just about me, Your Honor," he continued. "This is about the misuse of power, about the very fabric of justice being warped by individuals who forget that their duty is to protect, not to oppress." The room was now fully aware of the significance of what had just transpired. People shifted in their seats, their expressions ranging from shock to admiration. Desmond, once so sure of himself, looked like a man who had just realized he had lost control of a situation he thought he had firmly in hand. Judge Keller cleared his throat and looked at Desmond, his voice stern. "Officer Desmond, I think we've seen enough. You will remain here, and we will be investigating your actions. I expect you to cooperate fully." Desmond, now visibly deflated, nodded curtly but remained silent. The judge turned to Johnson, giving him a small, approving nod. "Mr. Dixon," Judge Keller said, his tone now respectful, "thank you for your patience and your integrity in this matter." Johnson simply nodded, though inside, he felt a surge of relief and pride. This was more than a personal victory. It was a triumph of justice, a reminder that the truth had the power to bring light into even the darkest of situations. As the courtroom began to settle, Johnson felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had faced down injustice, not with anger or violence, but with calm determination and the unwavering belief that doing what was right would always carry the day. This moment would stay with him for the rest of his life, not just as a reminder of his own strength, but as proof that sometimes the truth really could set people free. Johnson let the moment linger, his eyes never leaving Desmond as the room fell into an expectant silence. Then, in a calm, unwavering tone, he spoke again. "I'm the chief federal prosecutor for this district and several others. My duties often involve overseeing civil rights cases, including those alleging abuses of power." The color drained from Officer Desmond's face so quickly it was almost comical. Judge Keller, though his expression remained composed, raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, as though confirming something he had already suspected. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, a whisper rippled through the gallery. "Oh my goodness," someone muttered. Another voice followed. "I knew there was something about him." Johnson continued, his gaze fixed on Desmond. "You accused me of obstructing justice when, in fact, you were harassing an innocent teenager. I sought only to defend him from your baseless threats." His voice was steady, carrying the weight of a seasoned legal mind, yet there was no mistaking the deep undercurrent of anger. "This cannot be tolerated by me, by this court, or by any citizen who believes in the rule of law." Desmond, his bravado completely shattered, stumbled over his words. I had no idea," he stammered, but found no sympathy in the faces around him. The silent condemnation from the crowd was more powerful than any outburst could have been. Judge Keller cleared his throat, his voice measured. "Officer, your actions appear not only unprofessional but potentially illegal. I'm ordering an immediate review of your conduct. Mr. Dixon, you have the court's apologies for any inconvenience." The judge's voice softened slightly as he addressed Johnson with a modicum of respect. "All charges against you are, of course, dismissed." A wave of relief and validation washed over Johnson. He glanced at the spectators, many of whom began to break into quiet applause. Some nodded in respect, while others seemed stunned by the swift turnaround of events. It wasn't just a personal victory for Johnson. It was a moment that underscored a much larger truth about justice, race, and power. Desmond stood there, stripped of his self-assurance. Behind him, murmurs circulated about a formal investigation, the possibility of disciplinary action, even termination. As the bailiff motioned for Desmond to step away, the officer's shoulders slumped in defeat. Johnson caught one final glimpse of him before he was led out of the courtroom, a broken shell of the man who had dragged him in with such arrogance. Outside the courthouse, the same steps where the confrontation had first begun now felt different. The air was still thick and muggy, but there was a sense of triumph that underlay the humidity. People approached Johnson, some to shake his hand, others to offer words of gratitude or admiration. The elderly woman he had helped earlier appeared, giving him a small encouraging nod, as if to say, "See? Doing good always matters." Johnson inhaled the warm air and gazed at the imposing columns of the courthouse, reflecting on how often these halls had failed people who looked like him. But not this time. Today, the truth had come out swiftly and powerfully, reminding him and everyone watching that justice, though it may stumble, can still stand tall when the right people hold it up. He descended the steps with measured grace, determined to carry this sense of victory into future battles. He was an older man now, but his resolve burned brighter than ever. After all, each hard-won fight for fairness made the next one a little more possible. And on this day, Johnson Dixon, chief federal prosecutor and unwilling defendant, had proven just how quickly the tide could turn when truth stepped out of the shadows and into the light.